But your topic here has been the Jay Treaty, and I know that you've talked to Greg DeBooz this morning, legal counsel, in relation to the Jay Treaty and how that sits within the legal confines or the context of both American and Canadian law. I think Greg is one of the leading experts on this area, and certainly I hope that he was able to answer your questions in that regard. And I know that Chief Harley Chappell was here with you this morning from the Semiahmoo First Nation in Canada, and I know that they wanted Chief Chappell here to talk about some of the ramifications to First Nations in Canada about the Jay Treaty and how the Jay Treaty figures into trade relations and trade issues that First Nations have in Canada. I dare say that a lot of Canadians and perhaps a lot of Americans know little about the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty is tucked inside of some historical events that make it, from some perspectives, almost overridden perhaps by later treaties, not very significant in the history of the Americas. But from our perspective, the Jay Treaty is very important. It's very significant, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. A lot of my work, because I served 15 years as the chief of my own First Nation at Skowkale, we've been working on what's called the recognition of Indigenous rights. Aboriginal rights in Canada, as in the United States, as in Australia, is based on the notion that Aboriginal people were here prior to the arrival of Europeans to their homelands, and that they have Indigenous rights, including land rights, water rights, and rights to self-government. And this struggle of getting our rights in Canada, at least in British Columbia, recognized has culminated in several Supreme Court of Canada decisions. The Supreme Court of Canada is the highest court in Canada. Now we're in British Columbia writing treaties, just now writing treaties with and negotiating treaties with the federal government. And the problem that we're having is that the American and Canadian Europeans have been here since the 1700s. At least they began to arrive on the east coast of North America, forming the then 13 colonies, forming colonies in what was then British territory. I mean, the motion of movement westward of the colonists meant that they inevitably came in contact with Aboriginal people, Indigenous people who were there already. And the problem that we have in trying to negotiate the recognition and settlement of Aboriginal title today is that we've got this 100, 200, 300-year history of the changing view that Europeans have of Aboriginal people. And when I say the changing view, the perspective that, and I can't speak for Europeans other than for what we run across when we begin to meet with them in negotiations. But from our perspective, Aboriginal people have not always been viewed in the same way. The Jay Treaty, of course, is set in its own historical context in this changing perspective over the last 200-300 years. And the colonial view of Aboriginal people begins, of course, with first contact, and this has been popularized by a lot of movies, of course, the least of which is Pocahontas, where you see colonial people coming looking for resources and entering into conflict or sometimes peace agreements with Indigenous people. The colonizers, European powers, came with the view that they were bringing civilization to what would be called uncivilized peoples. Certainly North America wasn't the first continent that they'd come to. Colonialism had been going on throughout history through Africa, Asia, and onwards. Colonialism probably stopped at China when China turned colonial people back, Britain back. And so the idea that indigenous people were this tribal people living off the land also contained this notion of the romantic Indian, the Indian that was this noble savage living there in peace and tranquility in the wilderness, and surviving in this kind of pristine environment. Of course, some of that is true, a lot of it isn't. It was simply made up by people like Gray Owl, who wrote books about it and popularized that view in Europe. Aboriginal people were living on the land, of course, in their own nations. The Six Nations, of course, writing their own treaties with other nations, getting other nations to live under their control and power as satellite nations. The Six Nations in those days had their own diplomacy rules. They had their own nation-to-nation rules as well. So the notion, the early colonial view was also informed by the fact that Europe itself was in the throes of a centuries-old war between France and England. That war spilled over into the New World, and as we can see in history, the Aboriginal nations that were affiliated with the French sided with the French in these wars, and those that were affiliated with the British sided with the British. And sometimes these old affiliations reflected the old wars that existed before Europeans arrived. The fact that these tribes nations were at war together didn't change when Europeans arrived. It just added a new aspect, and that was that these Europeans allied with these tribes to fight each other. So we've seen the view of indigenous peoples change as well from this perspective of this wilderness living tribal people who are living off the land, who didn't particularly own anything, but were kind of roaming around looking after their own people, transformed into sort of this allied relationship where they were purposefully seeking these nations and their assistance with their own conflicts between Spain, France, and England. So in the midst of all of this, of course, when these wars ended, the allied tribes that were fighting in these wars alongside European nations, they began to write peace treaties with these nations. Treaties to stop wars or to become allies. These early treaties often were not written. Sometimes they were done in wampum belts. Sometimes they were simply agreements between the nations. And occasionally they would be written down. But these early treaties represented a shift again from these nations simply being allies to these nations actually being nations, where they thought of them as at a time when we need to make peace with you, that we're not going to fight, we're going to exchange our prisoners, in fact. And so these peace treaties began to be the first documents or agreements that reflected the relationship shift that had happened at the end of these British and French wars in the United States and Canada. Of course, as this was happening, the United States formed its own nation in 1776. It forced the Indians out of the 13 colonies west to what was then called the Indian Territories. The United States began to write treaties with the Indians pursuant to then the 1763 Royal Proclamation of King George that said that the Indians actually owned the land, that they were living under our British protection, that they could only get the Indian land with the Indian consent. So the United States and Canada both began to what was then called a process of purchasing land from the Indians. But the Americans forcing the Indians out of the 13 colonies using military force to remove Indians, the shift again happened where the Indians were no longer simply indigenous nations fighting on the side of the Americans or the Canadians. They were now becoming enemies of the state, people that had to be dealt with no longer by the president, but dealt with by the Secretary of War. And so you see tribes and nations in the United States now being dealt with by the Secretary of War, and the military force was being used to contain Indians on reservations that they were required to stay on. They were in fact imprisoned on these reservations. They could not leave them in the early history of the United States and in Canada without the permission of the government. So you began to see this huge shift from the very beginning when explorers found indigenous people living freely in our lands. They had their own inter-tribal wars, international wars. Many of them had diplomacy, many of them had hereditary leadership, many of them had forms of government and spiritual and religious organizations that they had. And what was happening, of course, is that what was shifting was not the way Native people viewed themselves, but the way Europeans viewed indigenous people. When the treaties in the United States were finalized, the last ones having, in fact, occurred here in Washington, and many of the last ones occurring in Canada, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, Aboriginal people by then had been subjected to being wards of the government, relying on food stamps, relying on food to survive even, because they were not allowed to live off the land. The Americans, of course, practiced scorched earth policy, in my view, when they wiped out the buffalo and starved many of the tribes into submission. So this shift, this shifting view of indigenous people is the historical setting in which the Jay Treaty was written. The Jay Treaty was written at a time when both the United States and Canada was expanding their territories west. The Louisiana Purchase is a prime example in the United States, when the United States was buying land from France held by Napoleon to expand its territory west. And the Indian territories that existed was created by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in my view, were directly impacted by that westward expansion. And the Indians knew it. The Indians were fighting. A lot of the tribes tried to fight the American expansion west to their demise. So what you've got is the Jay Treaty at the end of the War of 1812. You got to remember, the War of 1812 was this attack in response to American expansionism, and the War of 1812 was Britain stepping in and assisting Aboriginal tribes even fighting the American expansion. And so the Jay Treaty came at a time when the Americans and the British, not Canada, the British were making peace with each other. And so the Indians were allies to these two groups. And so the Indians were never part of the negotiations of the Jay Treaty. Mr. Jay, who was then, I believe, was the Secretary of War for the Americans, was sent to negotiate this agreement. And as an afterthought, they decided that, oh, what do we do with the Indians? We have to let them carry on doing what they were doing, essentially. It was a free trade agreement that recognized that the indigenous people weren't covered by the Jay Treaty, which is crucial. The Indians aren't, this is an agreement between the United States and Britain. Oh, but the Indians aren't, they're not citizens of every nation. Otherwise, they wouldn't have mentioned the Indians separately. The Jay Treaty would have been silent on the Indians. But the view that the Americans and the British had of the Indians at the time as a shift was happening through was that the Indians weren't part of either nation, so they had to be mentioned separately. And the only basis for that understanding is that the Aboriginal people at the time were still being viewed as nations. Now you got to remember that the United States, the American president and the executive recognized the Jay Treaty and put it into law. And this law is still here today. In the United States, the Jay Treaty is still a legal binding treaty. It's an international agreement that produces its own law. When Canada became a country after this Jay Treaty, 1871, up till then it was under the entire control of Britain. And of course, someone argued that Canada didn't become its own nation until 1935 with the Statute of Westminster, and perhaps not until 1982 when Canada's constitution was repatriated from Britain. However you view that, Canada's particular nation, Canada did not do what the Americans did, that is, pass a statute recognizing the Jay Treaty. And because of that, there's a court decision called the Francis decision in Canada that says the Jay Treaty does not apply in Canada. Well, 1982 comes along when the Canadian Constitution is repatriated. In that Constitution, the Canadians recognize Indigenous Aboriginal rights under Section 35 and treaty rights. Well, I don't think they were thinking about the Jay Treaty, no. Because the Indigenous people as nations were recognized as nations and mentioned in the Jay Treaty. My argument is that Section 35 of the Constitution now recognizes the Jay Treaty. Indigenous people on both sides of the border, and I dare say, even though casinos exist in the United States and not so much in Canada, are still poor, essentially because they've been stripped of the traditional lands from which they garnered their own wealth. And it's true, Indigenous nations fought against one another, took each other's territory. I mean, this was a historic reality as well. There's no question about that. But the fact remains that under the Jay Treaty, there's an opportunity to offset the extreme poverty that I think exists on both sides of the line by this possibility of trade between the nations, right? The trade between the nations. And the Jay Treaty is, in my view, important for two things then. First of all, in my view, because Aboriginal people are mentioned specifically in the treaty, even though they were not part of the agreement, in fact recognizes by default, because they had to be mentioned specifically, that the Jay Treaty recognizes them as nations. And the second is that the Jay Treaty now, in fact, if push comes to shove legally, is a constitutionally protected treaty right under Section 35 of the Constitution. How do you go forward with this idea? Because, well, I've been talking about the Jay Treaty now for some time, and when I ran across it, I was very interested, because I do research on Aboriginal rights and title. I taught the course at UBC, the Faculty of Law, and did a course on perspectives for the students. And it seems to me that politically, the very least Indigenous people can do is get together to begin to blow up the value of the Jay Treaty. They got to put some life into it. They got to start talking about the Jay Treaty as recognizing nation-to-nation relationships. The second thing is they've got to begin to talk about how to utilize it from an economic perspective, and to see how it can be used to enhance the trade between the nations. One of the things that's happening is that the border, as an aside, is being used as a place to arrest Aboriginal people who have not registered things like feathers or medicine bags. And it seems to me that the Jay Treaty ought to be utilized to assist Indigenous people from being harassed in this way. And I realize that there are legitimate reasons why we don't want all kinds of people killing eagles and just selling feathers and whatnot. But that jurisdiction, in my view, belongs to Indigenous people. That we need to come up with our own ways of monitoring that misuse of what I believe to be a sacred trust. And we need to get the governments out of that arena and get ourselves into that arena where we're saying, yeah, we don't want abuse of our cultural sacred stuff either, but at the same time, we've got to stop persecuting genuine medicine people and people who are going from gathering to gathering, just exercising the right to perform the culture. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, and I'm sorry if I ran through it very quickly. I've studied this stuff for so long that I know the points I want to make, and I wanted to leave some time for questions if you had them. Thank you very much.